In this section of the course, we're going to continue to look at a variety of forms of public ritual, and then we're going to be moving on to looking at more secular versions and how they differ and what that means for our culture when rituals and public processions get taken over by, for instance, businesses or capitalistic modes of practice. But before we do that, I want to hone in on the term Carnivalesque and make sure that you understand it, because it becomes very important when we're looking at this part of the course. As we were discussing before when we looked at the example of Halloween, there are a number of ways in which many of the practices that we still participate in are actually parts of the liturgical calendar, even when people don't completely realize it. So I'm just giving you some examples here taken from the most recent liturgical calendar. And so we can see that in the Christian tradition, it goes from Advent to Advent cyclically. So these festivals are celebrated every year or observed every year. And the one that where Mardi Gras fits into is the period between Ash Wednesday and Easter. And so some of you will already know this, but there's a Lenten period before Easter, and that traditionally anyway was a time of fasting and repentance, very somber time. And so Mardi Gras, which is French for Fat Tuesday, falls just before that. And so the tradition was that you would have this revelrous celebration before going into that Lenten period. And so we see here that concept that Etzioni talks about, the way that the religious calendar manages human life. So it recognizes that we need a time to celebrate, but we also need a time of somber self-reflection. And so it's constantly kind of recalibrating even human emotion as it moves through the liturgical calendar. So here's an example of a practice that I suspect many people don't realize is religiously based, which is Pancake Tuesday. And I was surprised to find out, the more I meet people from Europe, that this is practiced all over Europe, Protestant countries and Catholic countries. And again, many people don't know what it's based on. So this is a typical ad for one at a church hall in Peterborough. But often it's just called Pancake Tuesday, and I think it's been actually celebrated at Nipissing. So, you know, no one's going to turn down pancakes. But the original idea was that because you were moving into a time of fasting, you were going to empty out your fridge of all the fats and sugars and all the delicious food, so you're not tempted. So you just eat it all on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday when you go into Lent. And so Pancake Tuesday is a kind of a version of Mardi Gras, essentially, and we see it also through the food ways of people. And I think, as we talked about at the beginning of the course, religion is lived in every aspect of life, and so the way we eat is also very much managed by religious beliefs and ways of understanding the world. I want to turn now to a definition of the word Carnivalesque, which was first coined by Russian linguist, critic, and philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. And so he was discussing the work of Rabelais, the French writer, and he wrote that Carnivalesque is the destabilization or reversal of power structures, albeit temporarily, as happens at traditional forms of carnival. So these were traditional folk festivals. And this can be done, as Bakhtin shows in Rabelais and his world, by mobilizing humor, satire, and grotesquerie in all its forms, but especially if it has to do with the body and bodily functions. So this kind of folk view, very earthy view of the world that calls into question power structures of a given society. It's very important to note that all of these concepts hinge on the idea that this only takes place for a period of time. And we talked about this in terms of tension management types of celebrations. If it goes beyond the bounds, as I said, the police are generally called and there's problems. So there's always that tension that this energy can escape the bounds of this very kind of prescribed time period. So one of the aspects that we find going back to the medieval period is the idea of the Lord of Misrule, which is truly such a fantastic idea. And So the idea that somebody gets crowned a kind of a king or a lord, so somebody who has no particular social standing suddenly for the day becomes this ruler and oversees the festivities in which all these power structures are inverted. And so I gave the example of Holi in the Indian case, where it's very typical, for instance, for daughter-in-laws to say nasty things to their mother-in-law, something that would never be allowed any other time. But this is sort of a little safety valve that allows people to move outside of their traditional roles and limitations. And as I said in the lecture, I would argue that a lot of this role gets taken up in our society now by comedians. And it made me think of an example that my brother was telling me. He's a conference organizer, and he had booked the comedian from Montreal, Sugar Sammy, who's a well-known Lord of Misrule. And so he probably got warned, I don't know, but as part of his shtick, he stands up in front of all of these, CEOs and upper admin of this big company that will remain nameless. And he starts joking about the CEO having an affair with his secretary. And my brother was telling me, as the organizer, he panicked. So all seemed to be well. The CEO laughed it off, which is always the best reaction when something like that happens. But we can see that idea of the fool, the court jester, the Lord of Misrule, that's calling into question the kind of pomp and arrogance of the people in control. Here we have an image from the carnival that takes place in Quebec City every year, which is the exact same. It's all part of this liturgical calendar, so it's the equivalent of Mardi Gras. It's just a lot colder. And I had a little epiphany when I was first developing this part of the course that the bonhomme is the Lord of Misrule. So he's always freaked me out, so it kind of makes sense. And I did notice in some of the photographs he appears to be wearing a Métis sash. So if anybody wants to work on this could really, there's a lot that hasn't been discussed about some of these practices. So the carnival in Quebec City, I haven't ever been able to go. It's always at one of the busiest times of years for me. But if you've managed to go, I'd really appreciate it if you could tell us about it on the discussion boards. One of the important things to note about these various carnivals that occur around the world is how they become very individualized according to the place in which they occur. And so obviously in the case of the Quebec City Carnival, it's in a Canadian landscape, so it's a winter festival, and so it also becomes a kind of celebration of Quebecois culture, maple sugaring and sleigh rides, etc. So kind of nostalgic view of traditional Quebecois/Canadian culture. And we can also see with Carnival here that it walks a line where it's become increasingly more of a family kind of outing. That Carnivalesque aspect is, I think, downplayed to a certain amount, partly because it's cold, but also because of that increasing pressure we're seeing in our culture to make everything sort of centered on children. So it's going to be interesting to see how it develops over time. Now that said, the Carnivalesque aspect is still there, as we can see from this photo. So these people are clearly extremely inebriated. So we do see this interesting combination of the family aspect and the Carnivalesque aspect at this version of Carnival. This is a photograph taken from the Carnival in Brazil, which is world famous, and increasingly people go there for Carnival. And it's interesting to see the Brazilian example because there's a lot of African influence within their version of Carnival. So again, as I said, that idea that each carnival is very much also of its own place, even though it's part of that larger calendar that everybody's sharing. And we're going to see that as with Mardi Gras in New Orleans, the Brazilian version is increasingly under pressure from tourists, and it's what I call the kind of Disneyfication of these community and religious celebrations, and we'll be talking more about that as we go. As we saw in the last slide, there's definitely an emphasis on beauty within Carnival, very beautiful, elaborate costumes, bright colors, and so on. But we also find the element of the grotesque, which is something else that Bakhtin argues that is part of that larger Carnivalesque. So Bakhtin's concept fundamentally included the grotesque body as a celebration of the cycle of life. So Carnival takes within itself the celebration of all aspects of embodied life. So the grotesque body is a cosmic figure of profound ambivalence. Its positive meaning is linked to birth and renewal, and its negative meaning is linked to death and decay. So the colorful aspects are obviously that celebration of life, and spring is coming and so on. And then there are also aspects of Carnival that recognize that aspect of life that is tied to death and decay, just as we saw in the case of Halloween. This image is taken from the Carnival in Venice, which is also a very famous carnival, and known for its elaborate costuming. And so we see here, I have to say, a very sinister jester. He's not looking as much fun as the Lord of Misrule. And so the whole idea of masking is very important at the Venetian Carnival, and they're well known for their masks that are very beautiful in and of themselves. This is another image from the Carnival in Venice, and you can see very clearly the beautiful costuming in the gorgeous setting. And so that aesthetic element is without a doubt a very important part of this. And I haven't been, I'd love to go, but it must be surreal to walk around with people all dressed up like that in such a gorgeous setting. And this has also led to tourism kind of, I would say, almost overwhelming, again, the Carnival in Venice. And this is becoming a problem, actually, because if you have more tourists than the local people, then it defeats the purpose of the carnival itself. Okay, I don't know if I'd want to meet this person in a dark alley in Venice, but this is a very interesting image because it contains that aspect of the grotesque. There is almost a skeletal look to this mask, and yet it's beautiful. It's a bit like that weird combination that you find in the image of the vampire. So the grotesque is definitely an aspect of the Venetian Carnival. And as with Halloween, it's interesting to think about why people are attracted to that. I mean, people go in droves to horror movies and so on. And so what is it in us that is attracted to this? I think Bakhtin, as part of Bakhtin's theory, he would argue that it's a recognition that these things are also part of the cycle of life. So life, birth, death, and so on. So grand balls are also a very common aspect of the Catholic version of Carnival. Now, I don't know if this happens in Quebec City. That I do not know. If any of you do that, please, again, write it on the discussion boards. But it definitely takes place in Venice and in New Orleans. So coming out of that, I would say French-Italian tradition. So in Venice, there are these very, very elaborate masquerade balls where people dress up with masks and beautiful outfits. And again, it becomes part of this kind of celebratory period before Lent, so that you're eating, you're drinking, you're dressing up. And so it's kind of a celebration before that more serious period of Lent. So I want to finish this presentation by beginning to talk about Mardi Gras. And this practice is going to be what bridges us into the next section of the course. Many of you will be familiar with this. Some of you may even have been to this celebration. So it takes place in New Orleans every year on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. And it has a long history going back into the religious traditions of the city. And it's also very inflected by African American culture because of its location in the southern United States. And so we see again that aspect of place becoming very important. And so here we see the procession moving through the French Quarter of New Orleans. So a long-standing practice of Mardi Gras is to crown somebody king of the festival. And so by now you probably can see immediately this is a version of the Lord of Misrule. So this quote-unquote king oversees the festivities and leads the procession for Mardi Gras. Masking is also a very important part of Mardi Gras in New Orleans as it is in Venice. And it's interesting to think about why that might be the case. And I think it's very similar to what we discussed in what happens during Halloween, that part of these festivals of inversion and tension management are about letting us get away from our persona, letting us get away from our traditional roles just for a very short period of time. And nothing does that like a mask that kind of obscures who we are on a day-to-day basis. So here we have two revelers who look like they're having a very good time. They're dressed up, one's wearing a mask, and there's music. And so music is also a very important part of New Orleans Mardi Gras, and music is an important part of the whole identity of the city. And so we can see that the people are celebrating, and I suspect these are locals. They don't have that look of a tourist, although obviously I could be wrong. I'm going to end with this slide because I find it amusing, and I think it contains within it many of the themes I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So you can see that the priest and the police officer are not as thrilled with the revelry. They have a look that says this might be getting out of hand, and so it really points to the fact that these types of festivals are often right on the edge of complete mayhem. And so the forces of control in our society, the church, the police, and so on, are kind of keeping a very wary eye on these particular kind of events. And that's become quite controversial in the case in New Orleans because it's often the tourists that are misbehaving. It's not the locals. And so there's a lot of discussion around what to do about that, because they've had to put in things like barricading, which never existed before, and that changes the whole nature of the celebration. So we'll be talking about that more as we move into the next section.